Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Iowa Brain Writers Club. Today we are reading The Thanksgiving Story by Alice Dalgliesh. Two Ships and a Big Adventure. It was a summer day in England. Giles Constance and Demarius Hopkins were on their way to America. As they waited with their father and mother on the ship, they could see a great deal going around them. They were in the harbor of the town of Southampton. Many ships were in the harbor. Two of them were taking on food and water and all the things needed by the people, going to a new country. The larger ship was the Mayflower. The smaller one was the Speedwell. Men, women, and children were on the ships with their bundles and their boxes. To the children, it was a great adventure. Anything might happen on the ship. Something special would happen to the Hopkins family on their long voyage. The passengers on the Mayflower and the Speedwell were of many different kinds. All of them were settlers going to settle, or make homes in a new land. Some of them were people, that we call pilgrims. A pilgrim is a person who travels to a far-off place because of his religion. In England at the time, everyone had to go to the same church. The pilgrims wanted to be free, to have their own church to worship God in their own way. So they had left England and gone to live in Holland. Now, they had come back from Holland to sell for America. Some of the people on the ships were servants, and a few were hired workmen. A carpenter like John Alden would be useful in the new land. Some people were going just for a new adventure. Others were going because they thought England was crowded. There would be more room to farm in America. Between the decks, there was a room, or space for the passengers. The sailor called this 'tween decks. In the lower part or hold of the ship were barrels of water and food. There were seeds to plant and tools for planting them. There were saws, axes, and hammers for building homes. Some of the barrels held things for trading with Indians. There was bright-colored cloth. There was beads and knives and little mirrors, and all the things they've heard the Indians like to have. Now the time had come for ships to start on the great adventure. The children would like to be on deck, and to see the land they sailed away from it. But the settlers were very busy. The captain gave orders for passengers to stay down below until the ships were out of the harbor. Only the sailors could be on the deck while the sails were being set. How crowded! It was below decks. Passengers had small mattresses on the floor, each close to the next one. There were small wooden books, or ship beds. A few people had cabins. In their cabin, Giles, Constance, and Demarius listened. They heard the rattle of the chain as the anchor was raised. They heard the sailors singing. They heard the creak and creak of the ropes as the sailors worked with the sails. The big white sails would feel the wind and move the ship across the ocean. May we go on deck now? Not until the sails are set. More strange noises, and more time to wait. Then the ships were out of the ocean. Soon, the captain of the Speedwell put up signal flags. These flags told the other ship that the Speedwell was in trouble. She was leaking and could not go on. Perhaps her captain was afraid to take such a small ship on such a long voyage. Both ships sailed back to the land. Some of the passengers from the Speedwell stayed in England. Some of them went on to the Mayflower. That made the Mayflower even more crowded than ever. There were 102 passengers on that small ship. Many of them were children. A ship sails alone. This time the Mayflower sailed from the climb out into the wide ocean with the little ship. Now she was all alone. Soon, even the seagulls that followed her had flown back to shore. Many people were seasick, others were sick, because they did not have fresh fruit and vegetables to eat. Most days they ate hard biscuits and salted or dried meat. A few times a week, they can make charcoal fire on sand placed in an iron box and sit around it to get warm. Then they cooked a big pot of porridge or soup or stew. Nothing felt so good as the warm food in the stomach. Warm days, sunny days, gray days, and rainy days. Then came a big storm. How the waves beat against the ship. Everyone was afraid. Perhaps they would have to go back to England. After the storm, the sea grew calmer, and the Pilgrims gave thanks to God. A baby was born to the Hopkins family, a baby brother for Giles, Constance, and Demarius. What was the new baby to be called? Some of the children on the ship had names like Love, Resolved, Humility, and Remember. There seemed to be only one name for a child born on the ocean. So the Hopkins baby was called Oceanus. The Mayflower sailed on, and the days and nights grew colder. There was plenty of time to talk about Virginia and the part of America where they were going. It would be warm there, with sunshine, flowers, and green trees. As the days went on, more people were sick. Would the food and water last until the ship came to land? Some of it would have to be kept for sailors on the ship going back to England. 2 months went by. Everyone was tired. No one was very clean, for there was no fresh water to wash in. At last, one day, a sailor called, "Land ho! What a hurry and scurry up, on the deck." There was, at the passengers all try to see the shore. As the ship came near, they could see evergreen trees growing near the water. It was not warm Virginia, with its sunshine and flowers. It was Cape Cod, and it was winter. There was no friends to welcome the Pilgrims, no houses to live in. But they had come to land, so they knelt and thanked God for bringing them safely to the new country. They sailed a little farther and came into a sheltered harbor, the new land. Everyone would have liked to go on shore, to walk on the good firm ground. The women could hardly wait to wash all the dirty clothes. But first, some of the men went to see if it was safe. They would be Indian. The settlers had heard all kinds of stories about Indians. So the men carried their guns. They would not shoot except to protect themselves. One of the men who went ashore was Miles Standish. He was a soldier, and he had been training some of the men to use their guns. Another was Stephen Hopkins, father of the Hopkins children. On the Mayflower, Giles, Constance, and Demarius waited and waited for their father to come back. Oceanus slept, and slept, as babies do. The men waddled through the ice-cold water, pulling the ship's boat up to the beach. They walked along the shore, and there seemed to be nothing but sand and more sand. They cut some sweet-smelling branches of junipers, a kind of evergreen trees, and then took them back to their ship. That night, the settlers had a warm wood fire. Some of the women and children on the Mayflower went ashore as soon as they could and had a wash day. There was a pond of fresh water near the beach. It was good to have clean, fresh clothes again. The Mayflower had brought a small sailboat or fishing boat. This had to be taken ashore and mended. Some of the men worked on it. Meanwhile, other men went on, looking for corn. They had heard about it from others who had been to this new land. They would trade with the Indians for seeds to plant. If they could not find corn, everyone might die of hunger. The seeds they had brought from England might not grow. They looked everywhere. Once they saw some Indians and a dog, but these ran away, back into the woods. They kept on looking for corn. No corn, but an old kettle, half buried in the sand. A ship's kettle? How did it get there? No corn, but a pot hung over the place, where a fire had been. No corn, but small hills of sand. The men dug down into one, and there was a little old basket, filled with corn. Now, they had corn to plant. They found other baskets. These were big baskets, and it took 2 men to carry one. Once they saw some Indians and a dog, but these ran away, back into the woods. They kept on looking for corn. No corn, but an old kettle, half buried in the sand. A ship's kettle? How did it get there? No corn, but a pot hung over the place, where a fire had been. No corn, but small hills of sand. The men dug down into one, and there was a little old basket, filled with corn. Now, they had corn to plant. They found other baskets. These were big baskets, and it took 2 men to carry one. They filled their pockets with corn. Someday they would find the Indians and pay them for it. One day they did see some more Indians. These Indians were not friendly. They shot at the settlers with their bows and arrows. The men shot back with their guns. After the Indians had gone, the settlers picked up many arrows on the sand. Now, the people on the Mayflower decided to sail across the bay and find a place to build their homes. They sent their fishing boat first to a good harbor. Then the Mayflower sailed across to a place marked on the map. It was called Plymouth. These settlers called it the New Plymouth because they had sailed from Plymouth in England. It was a cold December day when some of the settlers landed. Once again, they knelt and thanked God for his care of them. This was a good place for homes. Indians had lived here, and there were fields where corns had been grown. There was rich black earth for planting and plenty of fresh water. New homes in a new land. The winter was not a cold one, but it seemed long to the settlers. Many of them were sick. Many of them passed away. It was a sad time for everyone. Some people stayed on the ship, and others went ashore to work. They took with them some boards they had brought on the ship. They also cut down trees and made rough boards. First, they built a house to hold food. And some of the sick people stayed in this house. There were 2 smaller houses. One was used to keep supplies, and another one was for sick people. One terrible night, the roof of the larger house caught fire. From the Mayflower, Giles, Constance, and Demarius could see the flames. The men on shore put out the fire. With a great deal of hard work, the men built 7 small houses. Now the Hopkins family had a home of their own, and at last, spring came. There were new leaves on the trees and flowers in the woods and fields. Birds sang in the trees. The country was no longer cold and wintry and bare. It was green and friendly and beautiful. Almost everyone was weak and thin, for there had been so much sickness and not enough to eat. But weather for planted seeds was coming. Giles, Constance, and Demarius were happy to be out in the spring sunshine. Ever since they had landed, the settlers had been finding new trees and plants in this new land. They also found many trees and flowers that they had known in England. They told each other about them, as if they were meeting old friends. Here are oaks and walnut and birch trees, ash and wild cherry and plum, and here are strawberries and watercress. In April, the Mayflower went back to England. Now the settlers were alone, in this new country. Alone, except for the Indians. Sometimes the settlers saw smoke from Indian fires. They saw Indians too, but the Indians ran away. One day, a tall Indian walked right into the village and spoke to the settlers in English. He had learned it from some of the sea captains who came to that part of the country. His name was Somerset. The people of Plymouth were surprised to see that the Indians wore so few clothes. It was still cold weather, and how could he have only a little piece of leather around his waist? They gave him an old coat. Later, he brought another Indian named Sequoia, who spoke better English because he had been taken to England on a ship. The 2 told the pilgrims why there were so few Indians in this part of the country. Many of them died of sickness. It was fine to have friendly Indians there in daytime, but when night came, the settlers wished he would go away. He stayed, so they let him sleep in the Hopkins house, but watched him all night. Did Giles and Constance and Demarius stay awake, wondering about their strange visitor? We do not know. After this, the Indian chief Massaquoi came to visit. The people of Plymouth made a place for the chief outside of their houses they were building. They put boards and blankets on the ground and a green rug and cushions for Massaquoi to sit on. The Indians came to the meeting, wearing leggings of deerskin. Their faces and bodies were painted in bright colors. The chief was painted dark red, and he wore a necklace of white beads. The settlers went to the meeting, in their best clothes, with a trumpet and drums. The governor wore a red sash and a feather in his hat. The two settlers gave the Indian chief 2 shining knives and a copper chain to hang around his neck. Massaquoi promised to be friendly. When his people came to Plymouth, they would not bring bows and arrows with them. The promise of friendship was kept for 50 years. Squanto, the friendly Indian, stayed in Plymouth. He showed the settlers how to plant corn in the Indian way. The Indians put small dead fish in each place where the seed was planted. This fertilized the corn and helped it to grow. That year, men, women, and children worked hard planting, and that year, there was a good crop of corn. Everyone worked together in the harvest. A time of Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims decided to have a special day to thank God for all He had given them. They had done this harvest time in England. Now they wanted to have a Thanksgiving feast and invite the Indian chief and his people. And what a feast it was. Men went out into the woods to shoot deer and wild turkeys. The women cooked and baked. Only 51 settlers had lived through the winter, and half of them were children. Only a few women to do all the cooking. The older children helped as much as they could. By now, Oceanus Hopkins was walking, and a new baby, Peregrine White, slept in his cradle. Peregrine was born on the Mayflower, when it was anchored off Cape Cod. His name meant wanderer or pilgrim. The day of the Thanksgiving dinner was warm and pleasant. Long tables were set out of doors. Probably the pilgrims dressed in the best clothes they had, the men wearing big white hats instead of work caps. Then the great chief came, and the settlers must have counted the long, long line of Indians. That followed him. 1, 2, 20, 40, 50, 60. Yes, there were 90. Somehow there would be food for all. And there was. Massaquoi and his men had done their share, and they brought a deer to the feast. The Indian chief and the governor of Plymouth sat at one table. Some sat at tables, some on the ground. Elder Brewster, the minister, said a prayer, giving thanks to God for homes and food and safety in a new land. The Indians may have understood about their prayer, for their people had a Thanksgiving prayer of their own. They gave thanks to their God who made the trees grow and the corn grow and all kinds of fruit. After this feast, the settlers played games. The Indians danced. Miles Standish brought out his soldiers, and they drilled as the Indians watched. The Indians stayed for 3 days. The Pilgrims did not forget the hard times. They knew there would be difficult times to come. Still, they felt they had many things to be thankful for. They had food and houses and warm fires. The Indians were their friends. They were free in this new land, free to work, to make homes, to worship God in their own way. Perhaps they sang the hymn they had brought to the New World with them. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. And if they did, Giles, Constance, and Demarius sang with them. We hope you enjoyed this story. For more storytelling, please check out our playlist below. Don't forget to subscribe for even more exciting stories.